and welcome to On Deadline. I'm Dennis Owens.
I'm Kendra Nichols.
And I'm Amanda St. Hilaire. Thank you for joining us.
If you're listening for the first time, we are journalists for ABC 27 News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
But on this podcast, we talk about issues that affect people all over.
These are the conversations you don't hear on the news. We're three different generations with different experiences, so we don't always agree.
And that's okay. But we do get very personal, get very real, and hopefully get you thinking.
We are recording on August 28, 2017. Today we're discussing monuments, Confederate monuments in general, Confederate monuments in the Gettysburg battlefield specifically. And we have one of our largest panels ever for a podcast. We have ABC 27 morning anchor James Crummell.
Hello, everyone.
We have two folks from Gettysburg. Scott Hancock is a professor at Gettysburg College, teaches history, has lived in the borough of Gettysburg for 20 years, also coaches soccer at Gettysburg High School. Scott is African-American. Welcome.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Dan Mal is not. He's a state representative from Gettysburg who I frequently find wearing a tie that shows a clash between a Union and Confederate soldier. So clearly you care about the history of your area.
It's where America was saved, so I certainly do care about Gettysburg and all it stands for.
I'd like to thank you all for being here. This is a topic that obviously has gripped the nation from coast to coast. A couple of weeks ago in Charlottesville, a protest and a counter-protest that turned deadly. And people lose sight of the fact that that initial protest sprung up from Richmond, Virginia officials voting to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. This past weekend on the West Coast, Berkeley, San Francisco area, there was repeated clashes. And since all this started, some statues have come down in Baltimore. First basic question on the floor, should those statues come down?
Who wants to go first?
I think the silence is a good kind of what people feel about it. It's like, what do you say?
You know, if you ask me, the statues were put there to recognize a piece of history. Do we want to erase history? Do we take those textbooks out of the classrooms that have pictures of these past generals? Do we have a good old-fashioned book burning someday and say, let's not teach our children all about history? After all, look where I come from. Look where the professor and I come from. We are from Gettysburg. Gettysburg was the turning point. Next to the Revolutionary War, Gettysburg was the turning point in the history of this country. Gettysburg was. Should we just get rid of the battlefield?
Well, let's turn to the guy who teaches history. All eyes on Scott Hancock. What do you say about that?
Oh, I'd have a lot to say about that. I think, with respect, I think that's the classic slippery slope argument that tends to shut down discussion. That, for instance, that if we have a discussion about whether certain Confederate monuments, not all, but certain Confederate monuments should be either if they should be there or if they are going to be there, what do we put around them? Do we educate the public about why they're there, about what stories they don't tell, and about what kinds of history they tell? Because they don't tell the whole history by any stretch. And so if we go from there to book burning, I think that kind of hyperbole just shuts down discussion. And so we don't educate anybody with that kind of response.
Well, and many of these monuments, and I know each monument kind of tells its own different story, but it's my understanding that many of them went up in the 1920s or the 1970s, and many see them as monuments to either the Jim Crow South or pushback against the civil rights movement. So what's kind of the historical context for that? Is that the correct context?
I think what her point is like, where are they? Is this monument on the battlefield of Gettysburg, or is this monument on a government property?
Square.
Yeah, I think that could play a role in whether people feel it's necessary, appropriate, needed. Would you agree?
Well, so if a community decides to put up a monument, I lived in Alabama for a while, went to school in Tennessee. So if a local community decides to put up a monument to a Confederate soldier, I think it's fair to ask, well, who in that community had a voice? And does that monument represent the whole community, and what kind of history are they trying to tell about that community? So Gettysburg National Military Park is a little bit different because it's a national military park. And there's a long history about how the military park came to be and why the monuments were put there. The monuments, the ones that I'm most curious about, and that Dennis and I talked about a week or so ago, are the state monuments. And so those monuments went up between 1917 and 1984 with 8 of the 11 state monuments, plus the Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Monument, all going up in the 1960s and 70s. And so then I think it's fair to ask, what's the message being communicated by those monuments? What were the motives behind putting those monuments up? What's the context? And part of the context, and it's not the whole story, but part of the context is they are going up in an era when Southern state governments are resisting integration. That's when South Carolina puts Confederate flag on their State House dome. Georgia puts Confederate flag on their state flag. And so you've got a resurgence of Confederate memory that casts the memory in a particular way. And for me, it's not a coincidence that it goes up. These things happen in the 60s and 70s.
And the monument that we specifically showed, well, 2 of them actually, but that we showed in our story with Mississippi, in which there's the inscription of they fought for their righteous cause. And this went up in 1973. So it's not like, Dan, this was put up in 1884. It was 1973. And if it can go, the argument would be, if this can go in 1973, why can't it come out in 2017 if that's the way some people would deem it? It's not like that's part of the quote-unquote hallowed history there. If it was put in 1970, how old were you in 1973?
24.
Yeah, so there you go. So I mean,
No.
And there's an inscription which Scott points out, which might be even more criticism worthy, were the righteous cause. Really, did people at Gettysburg allow somebody to put in a righteous cause? And if it was so righteous, why did the Union fight to abolish it?
Well, that's a good question. You can look at these monuments that we have in Gettysburg and take from what they say anything that you want to interpret the monument to say. One person's going to come to Gettysburg and look at a monument, read the inscription on it, and say, well, this means this. And the next person comes along and says, oh, no, that means something completely different to them. God knows in the building I work in, every word counts, and every word it has its own meaning. But,
and more than a few people have their opinions.
Everybody has their own opinion. And I can only speak for Gettysburg. What they do in the South is up to the South. And I think everything in a community should be up to a community. That's why we have elected leaders. That's why we have a big table like the one we're sitting around today, and they have discussions as to what's appropriate for them. But to have I guess what I'm trying to say is, who makes the determination besides the elected leaders of those small communities is as to what's right for that community. I might not like it. I hate it. I hate racism with a passion. But they might look at their Confederate flag down south differently than what people look at it here in the North. I'd never, I swear all the years I never looked at a Confederate flag and thought, oh, that stands for promoting slavery.
Right.
I never saw it. I just looked at it as a symbol of the South.
I'm with you. I understand and I agree, but you and I aren't the descendants of slaves and didn't live through some terrible things, and some people's generations were treated horribly under that flag.
Mm-hmm. There's no question about it. But, some people were treated really horribly under a German flag, too. Did we get rid of the German flags?
Well, the Nazi flag mostly, yes.
Yeah, the Nazi flag, but Germany has its own flag. I mean,
they do
really?
now.
I mean, we've gotten past all that. Our society today needs to get past all of it. And I thought we had done that years and years and years ago.
Well, that's going to be the second part of this podcast is my premise that this is not about marble and bronze and statues and monuments. This is much bigger, and in 2017, we haven't gotten past. But let me turn to James
I was just going to say, I think for many people, that taking down these monuments is part of the getting past it stage. For many people, they haven't gotten past it, and it was something that was a very hurtful thing to have in your face by going past a park or going past a government building and seeing these things still there. And to your point about these things haven't been up that long, being up in the 70s, and that this is still up there, getting past it, let's take this down and move forward.
I guess what I worry about when it is in the public square is a kind of romanticization of that history. So we talk about wanting to preserve history, and that is great. We need to. But I wonder how correct our idea of history is. And even on social media over the last few weeks, several of the posts I've seen do seem to say, well, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It was about states' rights. And it wasn't really about this. And well, not that many Southerners were slave owners. And I guess I get worried that we are justifying it. And in that sense, it's a revisionist history aspect of it. And then
I think it was about states' rights. It was about states' right to have slaves.
Right. Or people say it was about the economy. And well, it was an economy that revolved around slavery. So do we need to take these down in order to preserve history, I guess is my question.
We're making the comment that, haven't we gotten over it yet? I just wanted to share a quick story. When I graduated from college, 1999, my first job was in Tennessee. So I went down to Tennessee and I was immediately called the Yankee. And there were people with bumper stickers on their cars that said Yankee go home. And I was like, what? It blew my mind, but I'll never forget, I was the local anchor there. This is a very small community, so everybody watched this. And I happened to be at a store waiting to get a key made. And this guy came in and he said, oh, you're that girl from the news, right? And I was like, yeah. He's like, you're the Yankee. And I'm like, yep. And he goes, if it wasn't for people like you and Abraham Lincoln, I'd be sitting on my porch watching other people do my work. This was in 1999. I was floored. I stood there like stunned. I thought, is he joking? And he wasn't. And then the guy behind the counter was like, when this guy left, he was like, I'm really sorry. He's like, we all don't feel that way. So it was an eye-opener for me because I didn't think that still existed. But that was in 1999, and it did. And it was just shocking for me. I think that while some of our culture, there are people that have not. And I think, and maybe I thought it was kind of funny because in eastern Tennessee where I was living, I think it was part of the Union, actually. It may have been. So I was just I wanted to zing him and be like, well, you know where you live. But it was just, that to me was an eye-opener that there are still people out there that think a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, you go to my family's originally from New Hampshire. Parts of northern New Hampshire, you see Confederate flags everywhere. Those people are real confused. It's not just about where you live. There are people in states that fought for the Union that seem to identify with an aspect of the Confederate flag, and I think we need to ask ourselves, which aspect are they identifying with, and is that aspect a correct reflection of history?
But I also worry that we're just getting too offended about everything.
Well, let me throw a curveball. Let's go there for a minute. So just this past weekend, apparently a Memphis movie house, which always shows Gone with the Wind, has canceled that because of social media, quote-unquote, outrage at the showing of Gone with the Wind. In Philadelphia, they're talking about removing a statue to Mayor Rizzo. In Baltimore or New York, I believe they're talking about Columbus. Where does it end? That's a question too.
Yeah, but I agree. But I don't. I would say the fear of where it could go can't be an excuse to shut down conversation about what we're doing now. And it's a legitimate question to ask. Where does it end? And are we going too far? Are people too easily offended? But often I think that argument and saying, oh, it's just being politically correct or people too sensitive is just a way to avoid dealing with some hard questions. And so you're absolutely right. East Tennessee had a huge number of people who went and fought for the Union, as did parts of North Carolina and Arkansas. There's no monuments to them. If we're going to have monuments to Confederate generals and soldiers, how about a monument to Nat Turner, who led a slave rebellion in 1831 that changed the country in many ways? How about a monument to Denmark Vesey, who organized a slave rebellion that was short-circuited in 1822? Or David Walker, who published a pamphlet that was incendiary and pushed the nation further and further toward eventually what came the Civil War. So we, as a nation, we choose what monuments we erect and what monuments we don't erect. And the monuments to Confederate soldiers do come out of a revisionist history. And it's ironic because I get accused a lot of being a revisionist. I get accused a lot of trying to erase history. The first people who did this were the descendants were Confederate veterans and their descendants in the 1880s and 90s when they decided to make the argument that the Confederacy was not about slavery, it was about states' rights, and it was this vision of America that harkened back to the Revolution. And they said slavery was benign, we were all a happy family if the North hadn't come and messed everything up. And that's when the lies started. And that's when, and these monuments start to go up soon, in the 20th century after that. And they're part of this narrative. And again, this isn't every single monument. And I can't emphasize enough, for me, the discussion of the monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield isn't necessarily about removing them. And when you had asked me about that, I said, I wouldn't be opposed to that, but I'm not advocating that we just remove them without thinking about it. But it's at the very least, do we talk about or fund the National Park Service to put up signage about educating the public, which is what that National Military Park, one of their primary missions, is supposed to be about why these monuments went up, what they were about, and doing the research to figure out, okay, so what's going on in 1917 or 1929 or 1966 or 71 or 73 that generates the momentum? Because these monuments are not cheap. So they had to raise money, they had to do organization, and it wasn't up to the residents of Gettysburg. It was up to National Military Park, to the commission.
Because I don't think Gettysburg actually owns it. It's federal land, right? I mean, it's owned by the feds, and I guess you have to go through it. Dan, you were telling me that you have a better chance of getting on the space shuttle and taking a ride around around on that than getting something into the battlefield.
Absolutely, but outside that battlefield, it's up to the community. When you're talking the battlefield, it is federal property. Yeah. It's National Military Park. And you're exactly right. I stand a better chance of going to the moon on the shuttle than I would getting something erected on the battlefield. But outside of that, everything is up to the local community as to what monuments are placed where. How do you know what's in someone's heart when they make a decision to put up a monument somewhere? Look at all the religious monuments that have been coming down over the years. We had one right in Hanover that they literally had to cordon off a section of land and sell it. It was about 200 square feet to a private group, a church group, because it was a religious monument. How do you know that it wasn't all goodness out of people's heart when they put up that monument of a tablet with the Ten Commandments on it? How do you know that it wasn't just goodness, that it was going after those that don't believe in God?
Respectfully, though, I do think that it's not just about what's in a person's heart, because even good intentions can have negative consequences, and I think we do need to acknowledge those consequences. I agree that the best way to figure out what goes up in a community is similar to what we're doing today, and sit down and have a logical, civil discussion about that. But I worry that we're at a stage where that's becoming really hard. When people who are protesting and advocating for a statue's removal are referred to as snowflakes and kind of more derogatory language, that worries me, but I also get a chuckle out of it, because to me a lot of these Confederate monuments are participation trophies. So how do we balance that discussion but at the same time move toward a real solution, and looking at the fact that good intentions can have negative consequences?
Right. I was going to say, at the same point where, if the intention for it was good, the removal of this statue in Charlottesville caused a rallying point for white supremacists to all gather around this one particular statue. And at a certain point, does it become, if this thing is more divisive than not, is it important for it to stay, or is it important for it to be somewhere better than where it is in the middle of this town?
And is there a valid question? And here's the pulling the pin from the hand grenade and rolling it on the middle of the table. I mean,
you do that so well, Dennis.
Yes. Is there something about the Trump presidency that's why now? Why? What? And some people suggest that there's something about the Trump presidency that he has encouraged those groups. Why now? I mean, and why have we not gotten past the issue of race in 2017 America? We've been grappling with this thing for a couple of hundred years now.
Well, I'd argue part of the reason we haven't gotten past it, which I also find to be a bit of a false argument, because the people who always tell me, well, I should get past it, I'd say, well, if it doesn't matter to you, it shouldn't matter to you whether they stay up or come down. So clearly there's a lot of investment in it. But I would argue part of the reason we haven't gotten past it is because we've never told the whole story. We've told a very selective story that covers up so much of the reality. So you're never going to get past it, so to speak. I think that's not the right terminology, get past it. It's about dealing with it, right? It's about dealing with it. I mean, if you've got a abusive family history, you don't talk about getting past it. You talk about dealing with it and reconciling so that you can handle things in a mature way. Now the Trump presidency, you all are probably better qualified as that. Man, this is, so the history stuff I can talk about because I feel like I'm on firm ground there. I think certainly when the things he said in the first speech about Charlottesville, his first response and his third response, the on many sides and find people on both sides, I think that's inexcusable because I've dealt with sons of Confederate veterans people who are not the same as the KKK and White Aryan Nationhood. I'm not saying they are, but I've dealt with people in the KKK. I've dealt with Antifa people, and the Antifa folks that I've dealt with, I'm not saying they weren't willing to be violent, but they were nowhere near as ready as the white supremacists. And to suggest a moral equivalency between the two groups of people at Charlottesville, most of the protesters against the KKK were not Antifa. To suggest any kind of moral equivalency, I just think it's just completely wrong.
I know, just speaking with a lot of people since Charlottesville and the president's comments after it, the many different statements that he gave. Part of it, when you're having this conversation, it always turns to, well, so and so did this, and then this person did this, and there's always a knee-jerk reaction to try to compare it to something else. When if you are just saying, for a lot of people, we're just saying, why can't you just come out and say that these white supremacists did wrong? And then to say that and then also go on to other parts that weren't really what the conversation at that time was about, then for many people makes it disingenuous. And I think that is what a big part of the problem was from the very beginning. And I think that it also goes on to your other point about once that conversation got started, and these conversations about race are not easy to have. And once that conversation got started, it seemed like as soon as that was starting to heat up, well, then the conversation turned to, well, if you're going to take down these statues, what's next? You're going to take down statue of Washington. You're going to take down statue of Jefferson. Mm-hmm. And then that kind of turned the conversation. So then, of course, now that's another controversial, divisive issue that wasn't really the issue that was at hand, but now that's the next issue to jump to. And then, as you said earlier about the theater in Memphis, that's a different issue. They're not all the same things, but then you go from a conversation about race to a conversation about statues to a conversation about political correctness. Then you lump it all together. Mm-hmm. So then you really, it's just a big mess. And then lost. You're really never going to get to any kind of answer because now you're just making it divisive. And
Dennis, you and I always talk about, at least related to stories, we like when things are tied up with a neat little bow. And I think that's human nature. And so when we want to...
And what you mean by that is that the viewer is very clear about how it ended and what the point of the story was.
This is right, this is wrong, we're done.
Black and white.
And in some senses with this argument, I think we do that too much in terms of lumping things in their own groups instead of looking at things individually. But in some cases, I wonder if we're not doing that enough with being able to unequivocally say, hey, this is what the Confederacy was really about. And, are we going to be able to truly grapple with that? For me, like from a personal perspective, I look at it as more the person's life work. So the Jefferson-Washington comparison I don't necessarily see as fair because we can recognize these were imperfect, flawed human beings who we see their life's work as founding our nation. Whereas someone like Robert E. Lee, his life's work was the Confederacy. And I don't know that it is fair to our founding fathers to put them on the same platform. But I think we need to have different discussions about different people.
At the same time, Robert E. Lee on July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 1863 was in Gettysburg and his on a horse, I will presume. And
his statue
I can assure you he was not on a horse on top of a 70-foot high pedestal, but he was on a horse.
If it makes you feel any better, his statue is much smaller than Meade's. Much smaller.
But right. But nonetheless, historically, he was there. Right? He was there then.
Historically, he was against many of these Confederate monuments because he said he thought it was time for us to turn the page.
I mean, I don't think a statue of Robert Lee, like there at Gettysburg, the battlefield, marking where he was, or where that doesn't offend me. I think that's part of history. This is where he was. This is what happened here. To me, that makes sense. And when I take my kids there and I talk to them about what happened and explain who these people are, that doesn't bother me. If it's in front of the courthouse, I mean, maybe
then it's more of a trophy.
Why is it here? But when it comes to history, personally, it doesn't bother me. I like to say, okay, oh, that's where they were. This is who he was. And at the time, that's what he thought was right. And I don't agree, but that's what he fought for. To me, it makes sense to me. You're telling a story of our country and what happened.
Well, and one of the points that I liked that Scott made when I visited with him a couple of weeks ago, which did not get into the story because unfortunately there are time limits on the stories we can put on television, which is what I love about the podcast, is you think the museum in Gettysburg does a terrific job of giving context to what happened. Like, why were these people here in gray coats on that day at the appointed time? But you don't think, actually, that the battlefield, where there's hundreds of people running all over it every day, gives that historical context. In other words, it will say, this general led these people here and they clashed here and here's how many people died, but that's pretty much it. You were making that point to me.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the visitor center, which went up in 2008, I believe, I think they do a tremendous job. And part of the reason they do that is because, so Scott Hartwig, who used to be kind of overseeing the Rangers, told me several years ago that when they were going to put up the new visitor center, they sent out their Rangers and they sent out the NPS researchers, and they told them, we don't want you to read what historians like myself have written and others. We want you to just dig into the primary sources and let's see what we think, why this battle happened. Why, which is basically the question they're asking is, why did the Civil War happen? And they said it was just so abundantly clear from all the research they did that it was about slavery. That the white Southern leaders and secessionists and others are talking about this over and over and over again. And so they make that quite clear. If you go to the visitor center, the first exhibit you walk into is you go to the left, and the first exhibit you walk into, it's about slavery and that this was the driving force behind the war. And they kind of circle back into those kind of issues at the end as well. And so I think they do, I've been to it several times, and as, of course, a historian, I think, well, this could be a little bit better. But they do a tremendous job. The battlefield is a different story, and I don't know all the reasons for that. I suspect a lot of it has to do with funding. They just don't have the money. I asked them several years ago, could you put up a sign on one of the watchtowers that points visitors to the west? Because the west, you see the mountains, and the mountains is where fugitive slaves ran and escaped further north and came into Gettysburg. And fugitive slaves, among other things, are part of the reasons that the South got very angry with the North for not protecting slavery. And their response at the time was, man, we'd love to do that, but we don't have the money, not to put up a sign. So funding's a big part of it. But I think part of it is also that the battlefield we have this notion that it's sacred, that it's untouchable. And I'd argue it has never been untouchable. It's never been sacred in terms of what we have, in the ways that the country has reframed it. There's this, so Jim Weeks, who wrote a book in 2003, he's got a great couple lines here thinking about what these monuments, how they communicate. He says, a key feature of heritage over history, monuments are really about heritage, not about history, is a substitution of image for reality that turns illusions into authenticity. The power of images lies in their evocation of feelings regardless of historical facts. And I think that's what those monuments do. And on the battlefield, if it's going to educate the public and I'm not certain, but the last data that I looked at, it appears about 50% to 60% of people who come to visitors who come to Gettysburg don't go to the visitor center. They go to the battlefield, but they don't go to the visitor center. So there's a huge portion of the 1 million+ tourists who are coming to Gettysburg who their only impression of the battle is what they see in the battlefield. And I think that's a missed opportunity.
Dan, you look like you want to say something.
Oh, no. Everybody can have their own interpretation of what they think something should be. You know, I'm certainly not an expert, even though I've been in Adams County all my life, been around that battlefield all my life thus far. You know, I'm not a historian. So when I go on the battlefield, I see it as, I know why we had the Battle of Gettysburg, and I see how it played out. And to me, I am more intrigued of why the generals did what they did, when they did it, and how they did it. Pickett's charge, it totally interested me.
The strategy.
The strategy, the planning, the logistics of it, the fish hook, you know, it all, you know, and Chamberlain, what a hero. You know, he is my personal hero of the Battle of Gettysburg. But the professor's right. If you go into the museum, you go into the visitor center, you can learn the story. But for every story you learn, there's somebody else that has another story. There must be 1,000 books written or 10,000 books written on the Battle of Gettysburg, everyone having their own opinion of what you should know. I think it's up to our classrooms across America to teach this history so that when you go to the Battle of Gettysburg, you can immerse yourself in it. When you're on that battlefield, you know before you get there. That's an important part of our history. And why would we ever want to erase history? If you do, what's the old saying? You erase history, you're going to wind up repeating it, and that's a place we never want to go.
Well, but I mean, I don't want to erase history, because if we erase history, I don't have a job.
And I don't want you to have a job, Professor. I need you. I need you very much.
But you do bring up a good point about how we're talking about this in the classroom. A few days ago, I posted it was an op-ed in the Washington Post from a couple years ago, but I think it still applies, from a historian who made the argument that our textbooks really water this down. You know, pointing to, in some cases, you know, slavery being put under the category of immigration. Well,
I didn't think it was watered down when I learned about it.
But a lot of the textbooks and the way things are phrased, when you go through and read the passages, and I'll post a link to this op-ed in our show notes, and this is one historian's opinion, but it does make it, the textbooks he found make it seem like, well, you know, maybe slavery wasn't so bad, and maybe this was an issue of states' rights, and different places are going to use different textbooks. But I do wonder if we need to take a look at how we're talking about this in the classroom, and whether we're being more, I guess, relativistic, is that a word? Relativist versus objective, and are we picking selective places where we do either one?
I also think that, you know, you also, it's important to maybe not try to equate everything with erasing history. I mean, taking down a statue doesn't mean that you've erased history. There are lots of things that have happened in this country where we have taken things down or we have moved on. Doesn't mean that it never happened, and it also doesn't mean that you still can't learn about what happened. And I mean, first, one argument could be that, you know, we have now learned more about the Civil War, learned more about what Robert E. Lee and Confederate generals stood for, and therefore we don't want to glorify that in a statue in the center of the town. For many people, a statue to someone is someone that's great. That's someone
you're honoring them,
right? If someone said, "Dennis, we're going to put a statue of you up in Harrisburg," exactly. You know, it's a great honor,
right in the middle of the Capitol.
And there's lots of people that would tear that down.
But there's a great meme that I saw, and it says, and it's of people tearing down the Berlin Wall, saying, "Rare photo of leftists tearing down the little known Berlin Wall. You've probably never heard of it." And it kind of makes the point that, you know, we took down the whites only drinking fountain signs and put them in museums where they have context. Maybe we put more context up about when this statue was built and what it was a reaction to. I think there are so many different possibilities for us to make sure we're telling correct history, and it doesn't have to have this knee-jerk emotional response that can happen when we're having this discussion, even though it is a very emotional issue for a lot of people.
And the Robert E. Lee statue, which is the Virginia monument,
right.
It's hard to come away with anything other than grandeur there. It's awesome. I mean, he's up on this huge pedestal, got
Literally.
probably maybe the best view of the place, and it's hard not to get the message that this was an awe-inspiring guy.
Well, yeah.
And he literally is on a pedestal there. But my only question is, if people in Richmond, Virginia, are talking about taking down Robert E. Lee's statue, why wouldn't, I mean, if he's coming down there, where he was the head of the Army of Northern Virginia, he could come down anywhere, couldn't he?
Not in the National Military Park.
And I think, again, it comes down to context. So, Kendra, what you were saying, where a statue of here's who this guy was, here's where he was, here's the role he played in the Battle of Gettysburg. To me, that's different than a statue that says something that says the Confederacy is a righteous cause.
Right.
To me, that is a different.
But was
argument.
the statue put there because he was a brilliant general? Well, I don't think he was very brilliant, but some people think he was a brilliant general.
That's another valid point.
Or because he stood for slavery. Which way was it? And
See,
that's
that's
what I
the
meant
thing.
by what's in your heart. Are you honoring him because he was a general? Because he led the Confederate soldiers? I mean, he was a loser, but still,
Well, maybe not a loser, but he lost the war.
Participation trophies. I'm
why
telling you,
was
it's
the
not just the
statue put
millennials.
there? I said this at the beginning of the podcast. How do you know what's in somebody's heart? And I have to get this little piece in too. Watching on the news where this group of people threw some kind of a rope or strap around a Confederate statue and pulled it to the ground. Personally, I don't care why they did it. They broke the law.
Yeah.
They should have been arrested. That statue should have been voted on by the elected officials in that borough or that city and decided by them. That's why we have law and order in this country.
And removing, as they did in Baltimore under the cover of darkness, struck a lot of people as wrong, too. There should have been a more public conversation about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I had more ambivalent feelings about what happened in Durham, the statue referring to. I mean, I'd be honest with you, when I saw it, I thought, hey, go get them. But although I'm not advocating, misrule. Yeah, it's public property, but it's also a form of civil disobedience, which has a long, cherished history in American history. And when you talk about when you mention the vote, people who voted to support it or put the officials in, what I'd like to know is, so when most of those statues went up, Black people weren't voting in the South. So if there was a vote or the elected officials were responsible, I suspect in many of those communities, there was a large part of that community that had no voice at all in those statues going up. Sorry, I'm not supposed to.
Drive that point home.
That's a fair point.
It's a great point.
And so, and
it's time for another vote.
That's it.
It's time for another
Do another vote, and if the vote's thumbs down, then they do it in an order process and take it down.
What's next?
But the other, and maybe that's a way to address it. But I was asked to write this essay for City Lab, and this isn't self-promotion, but it's about, I think it was actually generated from someone who saw the TV interview, and so they asked me to write this essay. So it went up online last week, and the comments were just were intriguing is a nice way to put it.
Polite,
That's so polite.
And some of what the points you raised, we don't know what's in people's hearts when they put these statues up. There's some truth in that, but we actually can know because some of these people, like the Louisiana statue, well, there's a commission. There's a Louisiana commission that generated the money. They started in the late 50s, generating the money to put up that statue. I think it cost $85,000 when it finally went up in 71. And so they talk about why they want this statue to go up. And it's all about the nobility of the soldiers and the spirit and the sacrifice. And I'm not interested in denigrating the individual soldiers. I'm a son of an Army soldier, a warrant officer, served 3 tours in Vietnam. That was my life growing up, was around Army men. And it was a great way to grow up. It's not about denigrating the heroic deeds or valor of the soldiers, although I also say, a third of the Confederate Army deserted during the Civil War and a fourth of the Union. So we're the statues to them. So we choose what we want to remember, and we are very selective and purposeful in what we want to forget. And it's about recognizing that some of these monuments, like the Louisiana Monument, the Mississippi Monument, the South Carolina Monument, which says that they were fighting for states' rights, that these were monuments that were put up in a time and an era in which you had African Americans disenfranchised, an era, 100 years of racial terrorism that we tolerated as a country. And that's when these statues go up. And they go up after, most of them after World War II, when you see a resurgence of this neo-Confederatism. That's when the Confederate flag becomes very popular again, starting after 1948. There's no coincidence in all that. So we do have some idea about what was in their hearts when some of these monuments, not all, when some of these monuments went up. And those monuments, like Louisiana and Mississippi, they're not about the military tactics. There are others that are. And I understand that's the reason a lot of visitors go to the battlefield. But some of these monuments are communicating other kinds of messages that have nothing to do with the strategy, the tactics, and all that kind of stuff. And I think we need to be interrogating those messages that those monuments are communicating and asking if those should remain, and if they do remain, should they remain unchallenged?
I'd be kind of curious to ask the people of the councils in those courthouses or in those boroughs where they put up a statue of General Lee and say, why did you put it there? And just to see what their answer was. Mm-hmm. I mean, some of those people are probably still around to this day. I'd be kind of curious as to, hey, what was the impetus behind you putting that statue where you placed it?
And that's a great point, because I think now, especially now, even raising the question, that's where, suddenly you want to erase history, and that's the assumption. But having that conversation, having that uncomfortable, sometimes awkward conversation is the only way, I like the word you used, reconcile. The only way we can reconcile this, and the only way we can learn what our true history as a nation is to ask those very questions.
But I do think, and you guys all heard about the ESPN commentator whose name was Robert Lee. And then, I mean, that's the kind of stuff where I'm like, we are taking this too far. Yes, because of his name. I'm like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? That's where I think, not all, but there's some that take this and become just overly sensitive. And I mean, when I heard that, I was like, you've got to be kidding me.
ESPN's version of that, and I don't know if this is what actually happened, not to get us too off the rails here. ESPN's version of that is they went to him and asked him, do you feel comfortable, in light of some of the comments you might get, in light of these guys get threats every day? And he said, yeah, take me off the show. That's what ESPN says. I don't know if that's what actually happened. Mm-hmm. I wasn't there.
Well, that's still
to
a
me,
pretty
that
bad
is very
place,
different.
Right.
To
even
put
that he's
someone
thinking such a
yeah,
thing.
that in this day he has to be like, yeah, I don't.
Yeah,
I've done
but I don't
football
know
games
that that's
before,
a
and you say,
reflection
hi,
on
I'm Robert
ESPN.
Lee, and that's the last time you mention your
Yeah.
name.
Right.
And then you're talking about
And you're
the football
talking about
game.
the game.
Right. So I don't know if that was purely his choice and ESPN is taking the heat. I don't know if they're saying that to kind of cover their tracks now that there's been backlash. But there is a slightly different angle to that.
I was wondering what his middle name was. Like if it's Harold, then it's, hi, I'm Robert H. Lee.
Yeah, right. I think this is a valid conversation to be having. I just think there's always people on the fringes that take it a little bit too far.
There's a lot of knee-jerk reaction in this country right now. And as a business person and as a legislator, I can tell you knee-jerk reactions almost never work out good. Mm-hmm. You got to think things through and make good, rational, valid decisions. And if it's time for a statue to come down or be put in a museum, do it. If it was put there for the wrong reason, get rid of it. That's the lesson we need to learn. Civil disobedience can be good, but civil disobedience in Berkeley means picking up tables and chairs and throwing them through plate glass windows. That's not good. Throwing a group of people deciding what's good for the community without the leaders of that community making the decisions, that's civil disobedience, but it's wrong.
I kind of want to go back in a time machine now, though, and see what they were teaching in the South 50 years ago when they talked about the Civil War.
And even,
I would love to know. I really would. How did they teach it? I mean, I remember I was taught.
It's the War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's they frequently term the Civil War as an invasion of the South.
Oh.
And it's scary.
You look distressed by it.
Yes. I've never thought about that before. I would love to know when I was learning about it, what my counterparts down south were being taught.
And the reality is, so my wife's from Connecticut, and she talks about how growing up in the North, that she learned that, the Union fought to free the slaves, and so it's the Union good, South bad. Mm-hmm. And so, well, the Union had its own problems,
Well, yeah.
and the northern states were absolutely complicit in the industry of slavery. There's no clean hands in that story. So it's, and I recognize that as a country, we often paint the South and Southern states in stereotypical ways that are unfair. But the textbooks from the 1950s, I've read some of those across the country, but particularly in the South. Slave owners were kind, and the story from the black perspective is completely twisted. There was a joke that went around plantations in black communities in the South after the Civil War that I think tells a black perspective that mocked these kind of Southern perceptions. And you have two men sitting on a porch, an enslaved man sitting on a porch with his mistress, and it's during the Civil War. And the mistress, not as in sexual, but the white woman who was husband or wife of the slave owner. And so the slave owner's in the Confederate Army, and he's off fighting the war. And so this woman, let's say her name's Sarah, she says to this slave man, George, she says, if the Union Army comes, you wouldn't kill me, would you, George, after all that we've been through, and I've raised you and seen you? And George says, oh, no, Sarah, I would never touch you, Mrs. Sarah. I would make sure that you were fine. I would never do anything to you after all we've been through. No, I'd go over and I'd get my cousin Tom on the next plantation. I'd have him come over you and kill you, and I'd kill his owner, but I'd never do that. So that veneer of family that Southerners wanted to paint slavery in, from the African American perspective, was a really thin veneer that they would violate at a moment's notice, which is why 700,000 of them went and became contrabands, and 200,000 of them signed up and fought for the Union Army. I said, we need some of those statues in the South, in those kind of communities, and tell that kind of story as well, that black folks have known for 150 years, but weren't told in the textbooks in the 1950s, and are just starting to get told now.
Well, and it makes me wonder what people 50 years from now will look back on this time and think. There's a striking image during the Revolutionary War of colonists tearing down a statue of King George. And, you have the Boston Tea Party, which was destruction of property and an act of civil disobedience. And all those things were controversial at the time. And now we look back at them as this admirable thing. And I wonder what 50, 100, 300 years from now, people will look back on and say, that was a wrong move, or, oh, that was admirable.
Well, and my question is, we're in 2017. Where are we headed with this? Where's this going? Because obviously it's almost every weekend there's something going on somewhere in the country. Where's this thing headed?
Well, I think if we... Yeah, so...
Pull out your crystal ball.
Nice softball question there, Dennis.
That's a good question.
Well, so the pessimistic viewpoint would be, well, no, we're good, right? But I don't think, we're not headed to another civil war. I don't think that's realistic. No. I think that's hyperbole to think that we're in that kind of situation. But although, and part of the difference as a historian is, Americans were saying in the 1830s, in the 1820s, they were saying, if we don't resolve this, we're going to have a civil war. So they were predicting it then. They were reading the lay of the land and knew it was coming. Well, had a good idea. And you don't see that now. You don't hear that now. But if we shut down discussions, then I don't see how it's ever going to be reconciled. And these problems that W.B. Du Bois said in 1901, the problem in this country is the color line. That problem is not going to get resolved anytime in the foreseeable future if we can't at least have these discussions and debates in a public forum.
I see a lot of nodding heads.
2017 and where are we going and where are we headed? I think discussions are very important, and you want to look at things optimistically. And your knee-jerk reaction is younger people are going to lead the way, and it's older generations who are still stuck in their ways. But if you looked at Charlottesville and you looked at the white supremacists, they were young.
Yeah.
So where are they getting this from? Where are they learning this?
Yeah. At home.
Yeah.
At home.
And talk about having the discussion. So there were two local historians that I invited to be on this podcast, and they both turned me down, suggesting that if there's a feeling among folks that if I am a guy who stands up and says I'm standing up for history and I believe these statues ought to stay, that I'm going to be painted as a racist. So they don't want to have the conversation. We just elected a president, by the way, who every poll that was ever done before any one of his elections, he was not winning, and then he wins. What does that mean? That means people are not going to tell you what they're doing, but then go and vote for him. The numbers are right there. So that we don't want to have the discussion. We just want to have the. So I don't know where that leaves us, but I think it's a point worth noting.
Well, I think we need more people like the professor that has a story to tell, that knows the history, that can tell it from the other side, and maybe get some of those people like Harriet Tubman and the lady that refused. And excuse me, I'm not a history.
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks. Those people need to be honored as much as anybody else. As much as anybody else. It's those types of people from that side, from the slavery side. That story needs to be told more. It's not. I agree with you 100%. I don't live in the South. I've never lived in the South. Some people tell me they're still fighting the war down there. But somebody needs to go on a mission to tell that side of the story, maybe to finally get a resolve to this black and white issue that we seem to find ourselves in. I very naively thought years ago this was all way past us. It was my father's and my grandfather's generation. Obviously, I was wrong.
Me too. I'm in the same boat with you. But I think we may have to leave it there. Next week, since we've cured the whole racial problem on this podcast,
Just like that.
I think we should cure cancer next week.
Yeah,
And maybe
we'll take
work
it on.
that. But who's the moderator next week? Is it Kendra? You
Well,
cure
next
cancer
week
for us?
is Labor Day.
Yeah, so
So,
we're going to have to figure that one out.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you all. Great panel, great discussion. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. If you'd like to check out the links to the stories, articles, and videos we've discussed, you can find them in our show notes on our website, abc27.com. To get On Deadline delivered directly to your phone, tablet, or computer each week, subscribe in iTunes or Google Play Music. Please take a few minutes and leave us a review in the iTunes. We do read them, and your thoughts help us figure out what we're doing well and what we can improve upon.
And we have some new reviews lately, so that's been great. So keep them coming.
Excellent. And maybe we'll get to those next week.
Yes.
If you have any news, tips for the ABC 27 investigators, we like those as well. Any questions, topics you'd like to discuss during our weekly podcast, please send us a message on the ABC 27 Investigators Facebook page. Thank you to Eric Semmel for producing this podcast, Jason Dietz for composing and recording the music, but it is time for us to go. We're on deadline.